Good morning and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritang cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalena yacha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalena yacha yena divya jivanam Tannamami deva deva Ramakrishnam Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadattatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Jana. So this morning we will continue with our reading of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, where we left off last week. And that is, we're in the midst of June 4th, 1883. And in this text, it's at the bottom of page 233. So this was the afternoon of Monday, June 4th. So Manilal, a member of the Brahmo Samaj, believed in a formless God. Addressing him, the master said, Kabir used to say, God with form is my mother, the formless God my father. Whom should I blame? Whom should I adore? The two sides of the scales are even. During the daytime, Haladhari used to meditate on God with form, and at night on the formless God. Whichever attitude you adopt, you will certainly realize God if you have firm faith. You may believe in God with form or in God without form, but your faith must be sincere and wholehearted. Shambhu Malik used to come on foot from Bagh Bazaar to his garden house at Dakshineshwar. One day a friend said to him, It is risky to walk such a long distance. Why don't you come in a carriage? At that, Shambhu's face turned red, and he exclaimed, I set out repeating the name of God. What danger can befall me? Through faith alone, one attains everything. I used to say, I shall take all this, meaning his spiritual experiences, to be true if I meet a certain person or if a certain officer of the temple garden talks to me. What I would think of invariably would come to pass. So here Sri Ramakrishna starts out by talking to Manilal, a member of the Brahmo Samaj, about God with form and God without form. And of course, the reason for that was that Manilal, being a member of the Brahmo Samaj, didn't believe in God with form. And so Sri Ramakrishna, as he often did, was trying to convince him and other Brahmos that both are true. As you know, Sri Ramakrishna would often ask his newcomers, do you like God with form, or do you like to think of God with form or God without form? And whatever the newcomer would say, though in these days it was most often God without form because of the influence of the Brahmo Samaj on the young people of Bengal, then he would say, that's fine. The God without form also is true, but remember that God also has forms, and that God is beyond both the form and the formless. So Sri Ramakrishna would always try to expand the view of his hearers. He would teach them to have nishta, that is, wholehearted dedication to their particular ideal, but not to disparage other ideals. So as I think I forget whether it was Kabir or Tulsidas, but one or the other would say, sit with all, say yea, yea to all, but keep your own seat firm. Meaning, have a liberal attitude towards all. All different religious paths, all different religions are good in that they direct the mind towards God. So don't criticize other religions, but know what your own path is and hold to that firmly. Because the problem with liberality is that it can lead to shallowness. And the problem with zealotry and single-minded devotion is that it leads to narrowness. So he always taught people to include both. So he quotes Kabir, who said that God with form is my mother, the formless God is my father. So whom shall I blame? And then he refers to Haladhari, who used to live at the temple in Dakshineshwar long before, who, like Hajra, was also a distant relative of Sri Ramakrishna. And like Hajra, Haladhari also, though on one side he had some sincerity and some spiritual aspiration, on the other side he had some hypocrisy and thought a little too much of himself. But here Sri Ramakrishna praises his sincere practice of worshiping, which one was it in the morning? At night, the formless God. In the morning, God with form, and at night, the formless God. And so he refers to that with praise. And then he speaks in the second half of the paragraph about the value of faith. That if one, like Shambhu Malik, has that faith that I have set out on the path with the name of God on my lips, what harm can befall me? Then one is, by that very faith, one is protected. So then M now continues the narration. Oh, I should, before I read what M said, I should remind us that Sri Ramakrishna then says, in the context of talking about faith, that he used to think to himself, I will take all of this that I experience, all of my spiritual experiences as true, if a certain officer of the temple comes to speak to me, or if a certain person comes to see me, and that these things would invariably happen. So M had studied English logic. In the chapters on fallacies, he had read that only superstitious people believed in the coincidence of morning dreams with actual events. Therefore, he asked the master, was there never any exception? Because again, Sri Ramakrishna said that whatever he thought, that would invariably happen, and so M is a little doubtful. Even though by this time M had seen so many wonderful things in the life and the words of Sri Ramakrishna. And so he had great faith in Sri Ramakrishna already by this time, but that doubt was still not completely gone. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. That means that he had a critical intelligence and wanted to know for sure. Maybe Sri Ramakrishna many things seemed to come true, and so Sri Ramakrishna thought that that was happening, whereas actually it was just a coincidence. So he wanted to make sure. Master, no, at that time everything happened that way. I would repeat the name of God and believe that a certain thing would happen, and it would invariably come to pass. Then turning to Manilal, but you must remember, unless one is guileless and broad-minded, one cannot have such faith. Bony people, hollow-eyed people, the cross-eyed, people with physical traits like these cannot easily acquire faith. What can a man do if there are evil omens on all sides? So before coming to that last part, let me go back to M's doubt about fallacies, that he had studied English logic. And he, in the chapter, in the text on logic that he had studied, the chapter on fallacies, he had read about false coincidences, or that is, things that were purely coincidence that are taken as causally related. So the same principle is there in Hindu logic, in the Nyaya, the school of logic. They have a Kaka Taliyavat, I think it is. The example is given that a crow comes and lands on the palm fruit. It's like a coconut, but it's a different species of palm tree. Those from India know it very well. The tal. So the crow comes and lands on the tal fruit on the coconut tree, a big fruit, and just at that moment the fruit falls to the ground. So the question is, did the fruit fall because of the weight of the crow? That is, it was so ripe and so ready to fall that all it needed was the light weight of a bird to sit on it to break its connection to the stem. Or was it falling anyway when the crow landed? So in that case, of course, we don't know, but it's used as an example to show that in such cases, is it coincidence or is it causally related? We don't know. And so in the same way with Western logic, various fallacies are related. For instance, you see a black cat crossing the street and you've heard all your life that black cats cause bad luck if they cross in front of you. And after that happens, something bad happens. They say, you see, that it's true. I had bad luck because the cat crossed in front of me, a black cat crossed in front of me. Well, it may be that you're going to have bad luck anyway, if no cat had appeared or if a white cat had walked in front of you. It doesn't matter. Maybe the bad luck would have happened. So you can't say that they're causally connected. And that's how superstitions arise. Something happens that we notice, and then something good or bad happens after that, and we think that they're causally connected. That's why many people, in the West, in the East, in America, in Europe, in Africa, everywhere, people are always trying to find that kind of connection. So people here typically have their good luck hat, like a baseball cap or some other hat that they wear because they feel that whenever I wear this hat, good luck happens to me. And so, of course, we can see that things like that, there's very little chance that there's any causal connection between wearing a hat and having good luck. But we're always looking for patterns in experience. So that's what M was wondering, is Sri Ramakrishna just falling a prey to common human error? And so even though he had great respect for Sri Ramakrishna and a great belief in his spiritual greatness and his great wisdom, sure, it's possible that someone like Sri Ramakrishna could fall into error also of the same type that all of us are prone to. So therefore he asks, was there never any exception? And the master says, no, it always happened that way. So then this Sri Ramakrishna goes on to say that that happens if one is completely guileless and has deep faith. Then one begins to see that kind of connection. So we can't expect that. We can't expect that because I have some casual thought, and let me say to Sri Ramakrishna that Sri Ramakrishna, if this thought is true, then let such and such happen. And that thing either happens or doesn't happen, and to think that that is causally connected, no, because we're not in a state where that kind of thing normally happens. Even us normal people, however, sometimes we're either at an extremity where we're extremely concerned about something, or the mind has become very calm or something. Even for ordinary people like us, sometimes that happens. Again, it's usually at an extreme moment. Either the things are very dire, or the mind has become, for some reason, extremely calm. Then sometimes that happens. We think that if such and such a thing happens, then I will know that this is true, and then the thing happens. And we can feel not through superstition, but there's a deep perception that, yes, there is a connection here. That's God's way of speaking to me. Among so-called primitive tribes, they're not really primitive, but they're tribes that didn't have modern technology. Like the Native Americans, they would read signs in nature, but they would say that if a bird, like a crow or an eagle or some other bird or a fox or a bear, whatever animal it be, if it's doing just the normal things that animal normally does, then it's not a sign, it doesn't mean anything. But if you see something that they're doing which is very unusual at a time when you're trying to make a decision about something, then that's a sign. That's a sign, either good or bad. They would know how to read such things from cultural experience saved over millennia in their case. So anyway, Sri Ramakrishna was in that state where, and Holy Mother was in that state also, where Holy Mother would think of somebody would come to her mind, and within a day or two, that person, after a long time and a long absence, within a day or two, that person would show up. And so both she and Sri Ramakrishna were in a state of such connection to the divine and such a connection to the universe around them, a sense of unity, that what they thought, and also because they were so established in truth, in speaking the truth, in living the truth, in thinking the truth, that if a thought came to their mind, it would come true. So normally we are said to be truthful if our words correspond to what actually happened. If I say something and that thing actually did happen, which I say, then you say, oh, he's truthful. He told the truth about that. But a person who's deeply established in the truth, that is a spiritually advanced person whose whole mind is steeped in the truth, then it's said that the outer world begins to reflect their words. If they say something, then it happens in the outer world. For us, we try to be truthful by telling what has happened in the past. To such people, they say something and the world reflects it because of the power of truth. Sri Ramakrishna said that if one serves truth unflinchingly for 12 years, one gets the power of truth, where what one says comes true. So that's a special power that Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother had. And then in the last half of that short paragraph I just read, he says, the bony people, hollow-eyed people, cross-eyed people with physical traits like those cannot easily acquire faith. What can a man do if there are evil omens on all sides? So that's something that concerns people when they read that, because we think that, well, if I'm born with cross eyes, that's not my fault. I didn't do anything. That's just something that a fault of my genes or whatever. Or if a person is bony, that is the bones protruding on all sides. Then that also is something which is genetic. It's not a person's fault. Sri Ramakrishna believed, and I'm not going to try to prove it or to argue for it, but just to say that Sri Ramakrishna believed that there were physical traits which were reflections of the state of the mind, and that one could read those physical traits. However, we shouldn't put emphasis on that, because we don't know how to read those signs, and we don't know how to read modifying signs that the person might have. Like Swami Sharat Maharaj, or Swami Sharadananda, a great disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, who was the General Secretary of the Order until he passed away in 1926, almost from the beginning till he passed away. A great man of highest realization of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the servant of the Holy Mother, on whom the Holy Mother depended for everything. But he had one eye that he was wall-eyed, one eye that didn't track with the other eye. It was just a fixed eye. And so that, Sri Ramakrishna used to say, was a bad omen. And yet Swami Sharadananda was a man of the highest character and the highest realization. And so again, we don't know how to read these signs. In fact, when Sharat Maharaj was still Sharat Chandra, coming to Sri Ramakrishna as a late teenage boy, one day he brought his brother to Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna said, "Oh, your brother has better signs than you do. Shall I attract him?" And Swami Sharada, the future Sharadananda, said, "Yes, yes, that would be a great blessing for him if you attract him." And then Sri Ramakrishna said, "No, I have hurt so many Shaktis, that is, so many mothers, but speaking of them as embodiments of the Divine Mother. I have hurt so many Shaktis already by taking their sons and making them my close disciples. I can't do that again," because he had already taken one son from this mother, so he couldn't take another. So Sri Ramakrishna said that the other brother had even better signs than Sharat Maharaj did. But what's important for us is that Swami Sharadananda became a man of the highest illumination. So again, we shouldn't see a person who's bony and think that, oh, that person has no faith because they're bony. Look at that. No, we don't know how to read those signs. And there are conflicting signs which may modify the effect of the sign that we happen to notice. It's the same in palmistry. Whether you believe in it or not, there's a principle in palmistry that the different lines and the shape of the lines and the connections of the lines, everything means something in the palm. But a person who is just learning palmistry makes many mistakes because they see the line and take it at face value and say, "Oh, this means this." But many, many times, probably more often than not, there's another line on the hand which modifies the meaning of that line. And so if you just know how to read the main lines, then you may have a totally fallacious interpretation of what the lines on the hand say. If you knew in detail and had great experience in looking at the palms of many people and then seeing the people, observing their behavior so that you knew the relationship between the lines and the character of a person, then you could see the same sign and say, no, it doesn't mean that at all because of this. So the same thing with reading the signs of people. Sri Ramakrishna sometimes says that one-eyed people, that is not a good sign. But then Pauhari Baba, he only had one eye. And yet Swami Vivekananda said that Pauhari Baba, after Sri Ramakrishna, Pauhari Baba was the greatest man he had ever met. So again, we can't judge these things. We have to be humble and realize that no, Sri Ramakrishna knew what he was talking about, but we don't know what that means. So again, we shouldn't act on these things. It was dusk. The maidservant entered the room and burnt incense. Manilal and some other devotees left for Calcutta. M and Rakal were in the room. The master was seated on his small couch, absorbed in meditation on the Divine Mother. There was complete silence. So again, that's just setting the scene. But let me just mention, just out of interest for those of you who are not from India, that in tropical countries, dusk is short. In northern climes, because of the angle of the sun, when the sun goes down, it goes down slowly, and so dusk is very long. There's a long twilight period. But in India and other tropical countries, the sun it's closer to the equator, so the sun just goes directly over and down. And so dusk is not nearly as long as it is here. So when they saw that it was getting close to sundown, then it was time to go back so they could return while there was still light. So then, and also it's tradition in India, in traditional parts of India and in traditional places, to burn incense in the evening. And so the maidservant had come in to burn incense. After a time, Bhagavati, an old maidservant of the temple proprietor, entered the room and saluted the master from a distance. Sri Ramakrishna bade her sit down. The master had known her for many years. In her earlier days, she had lived a rather immoral life. But the master's compassion was great. Soon he began to converse with her. So Sri Ramakrishna never refused anyone. Unless the person was completely hypocritical and completely uninterested in spirituality, then he wouldn't waste his time on them. But if a person, even if they had, like this maidservant, had lived an immoral life, but they wanted to change, they were trying to change, then he had great compassion for them. And so he began to talk with this woman. Master, now you are pretty old. Have you been feeding the Vaishnavas and holy men and thus spending your money in a noble way? So again, she was a maidservant of the proprietors. And so because the proprietors were wealthy, she probably was paid somewhat better than maidservants were usually paid. And then because of the life she had lived earlier also, the immoral life that she had lived, she had money also. And so Sri Ramakrishna is asking her that because in old age, when we come to retirement, when we are older, that we should have this sense that death is coming near. So now let me prepare myself. That idea comes naturally to us if we are devoted. If we're not, then we think that I'm going to live forever, or even if we don't think that, we think life is getting away from me, so I better get as much enjoyment now as possible before I'm incapable of enjoying. But for a person who's devoted, then as we cross over the hump beyond middle age and start on our downward path, the downward path on the other side of the hump of life, then we begin to think naturally that life is short, life is going to come to an end. Now I feel my mortality, so let me begin to take care of things. And so things like charity, Sri Ramakrishna mentions traditional charitable acts like feeding holy men and Vaishnavas, etc. So are you spending your money in a noble way? Because it will be good for you. You have money, so spend it in a noble way. Bhagavati smiling. How can I say that? So that, again, for those of you not from India, that's a way of saying that if I say, yes, I'm doing that, then that sounds egotistical. So the truth is, she was spending money in a good way. She was being charitable. So she can't say, no, I don't. But she doesn't want to sound egotistical and say, oh, yes, I'm giving money for good causes. So she just says, how can I say that, smiling? Master, have you been to Vrindavan, Benares, and the other holy places? Again, because she's getting elderly, and so it's good to go to holy places. And especially, Sri Ramakrishna would say different advice to different people who had the ability to meditate, to do japa and all of that, people who had done spiritual practice. Then he would say, what's the use of going to holy places? Just to sit still and do your practice. If you don't have it here, you won't have it there. So what's the use of going there? Develop your meditation, your prayer, everything here. But for someone, an ordinary person like this maidservant, then yes, it's good to go to holy places, because if you just sit here, you're in the midst of your old habits and things don't change easily. But if you go to holy places, that will create good memories. And so according to the person, Sri Ramakrishna would speak. So have you been to Vrindavan, Benares, and other holy places? Bhagavati smiling. How can I say that? I have built a bathing place, and my name is inscribed on a slab. So her desire to say what she's done gets the best of her. So she starts out by, how can I say that? And then she begins to elaborate. In fact, this particular passage in the gospel became somewhat well known among some of our monastics in the Western centers, the American centers. And so whenever we would ask a fellow American monastic, have you done such and such a thing, meaning something good, then everybody would reply, oh, how could I say that? Quoting her. So I have built a bathing place, and my name is inscribed there on a slab. So that also is a traditional act of charity mentioned in the scriptures, building bathing ghats, etc. Master, Indeed. Bhagavati, yes, sir, my name, Srimati Bhagavati Dasi, is written there. Master with a smile, how nice. So again, with a smile means he's pleased. He finds it humorous, but he's not laughing at her. He's smiling pleasantly at her and saying, how nice, that's good. Again, encouraging her. And so his encouragement went to the point where, emboldened by the master's words, Bhagavati approached and saluted him, touching his feet. Like a man stung by a scorpion, Sri Ramakrishna stood up and cried out, Govinda, Govinda. A big jar of Ganges water stood in a corner of the room. He hurried there, panting, and washed with the holy water the spot the maidservant had touched. The devotees in the room were amazed to see this incident. Bhagavati sat as if struck dead. So here, this is also a passage which is very difficult for many people, understandably difficult, because here this woman is trying to be good, and Sri Ramakrishna is encouraging her and everything, though she had a immoral past. She probably lived as something of a prostitute, and in her youth. And so she comes, and emboldened by Sri Ramakrishna's praise and pleasant demeanor and everything, she comes and touches his feet in an act of respect. And Sri Ramakrishna shouts as if he had been stung by a scorpion. People say, well, if Sri Ramakrishna was God, why shouldn't he be able to accept the sins of others? Why should he react like that, rejecting somebody? No. He wasn't rejecting anyone. He wasn't rejecting. This was an involuntary fact that his body and mind were so pure through his many years of spiritual practice and a lifetime of complete dedication of his mind to God, that the touch of anything which was not pure would cause excruciating pain. So it wasn't that Sri Ramakrishna was judging her at all. It was the fact that his body couldn't bear it. It was unbearably painful. You see that in the life of Holy Mother as well, who accepted one and all. But at times the pain was so great that she would have to wash her feet again and again to get over the pain from people who had led immoral lives touching her. So she accepted them, but the pain was excruciating. It's even said, I've heard from Gayatri Devi, the niece of Swami Paramananda. Paramananda, or Vasant Maharaj, was a great disciple of Swami Vivekananda, his youngest monastic disciple. I think he was 16 when he came to Swamiji and joined the order. So just came as a teenager. And he came to America, lived in America, and after his death, his ashram separated from the order only after he died. And his niece, Gayatri Devi, became in charge. And so I knew her well. I saw her on various occasions. And so she told me that her uncle, Swami Paramananda, was so pure that because he was in America, he would shake hands with everyone. All of our Swamis used to do that, the Indian Swamis. After lectures, none of this business, because they thought, we've come to America, this is the custom in America. And so we have to learn the customs of the country and respect to the country, the customs of the country. So they would shake hands with people after the lecture rather than greeting them this way, which of course in America at that time no one understood or had, looked strange here. But Gayatri Devi said that he would feel such intense burning in his hand after shaking hands with people that he would have to go and soak it in cold water to get over the burning, to get relief from the burning sensation. And so Sri Ramakrishna was made of pure sattva. So his purity was extraordinary. It was not like that of even a great saint. It was that of one who had the purity of the divine being itself. And so again, this was an involuntary response. And as we see in what's coming, he tried to placate her, to make her feel, to remove her embarrassment, to please her. So again, it wasn't Sri Ramakrishna rejecting her at all. It was something that it was literally unbearable to him. So Bhagavati sat as if struck dead. Sri Ramakrishna consoled her and said in a very kindly tone, "You should salute me from a distance." In order to relieve her mind of all embarrassment, the master said tenderly, "Listen to a few songs." The master then sang about the Divine Mother. "The black bee of my mind is drawn in sheer delight to the blue lotus flower of Mother Shama's feet," that is, to Mother Kali's feet. Then he sang, "High in the heaven of the mother's feet, my mind was soaring like a kite, when came a gust of sin's rough wind that drove it swiftly toward the earth." And again he sang, "Dwell, O mind, within yourself." All of these are famous songs, like this one, "Dwell, O mind, within yourself. Atmani apni mone teko." Dwell, O mind, within yourself. Enter no other's home. If you but seek there, you will find all you are searching for. God, the true philosopher's stone, who answers every prayer, lies hidden deep within your heart. Lies deep within your heart, the richest gem of all. How many pearls and precious stones are scattered about the outer court that lies before the chamber of your heart. So again, Sri Ramakrishna did what he could to placate her, to remove her embarrassment, and to make her feel good. And so thus ends that day, June 4th, or at least thus ends the Gospel's narration of that day. Then we come to Tuesday, June 5th, 1883, that is the very next day. Rakhal and Hajra were staying with the master in the temple garden at Dakshineshwar. M too had been there since the previous Sunday. As it was a weekday, there were only a few devotees in the room. Generally, people gathered there in large numbers on Sundays or holidays. It was afternoon. Sri Ramakrishna was telling the devotees about his experiences during his God-intoxicated state. Master to M: "Oh, what a state I passed through. At that time, I didn't eat my meals here, that is, in the garden, in the temple grounds. I would enter the house of a Brahmin in the village, or at Baranagore, or at Aryadaha. Generally, it would be past mealtime when he would go to these houses. I would just sit down there without saying a word. If the members of the household asked me why I had come, I would simply say, 'I want something to eat.' Now and then I would go uninvited, of course, to Ram Chatterjee's house at Alambajar or to the Chaudhuris at Dakshineshwar, but I didn't relish the food at the Chaudhuris' house." So here, again, we see Sri Ramakrishna's nature expressed in this, that he would go uninvited, he'd just show up and go into the house and just sit down. Now that, of course, that sort of thing doesn't happen here, because in the West, there's a tradition of respecting privacy and all of that. In India, you don't have that. In India, whether you're in the monastery or you're out in society in a house or something, people come and go freely. It's not that you lock the doors and somebody has to come and knock on the door. That's one of the things Westerners have to get used to when they go to stay in India, is that anybody may just come through the door at any time. And because that's the practice, that's the once you get used to it, it's nice that there's not that idea that I have to protect my privacy and everyone should respect my privacy and stay away. No, the society is much more open than it is here. But again, it's not so much good or bad, but we shouldn't think that that practice is bad. You get used to it and then you begin to see the beauty of the practice. So, but as I was saying, we see the nature of Sri Ramakrishna here, that he was a true sannyasin. He usually wore a white cloth. He didn't wear this cloth, as he told Totapuri when he became a sannyasi, because he was a sannyasi. He formally took sannyasa. He went through the ceremony of sannyasa with Totapuri, his guru. But he told Totapuri that I want to change my name and I want to wear Gerwa cloth because it will hurt my elderly mother. Because in the tradition, when you renounce the world, you renounce all family ties. And so his mother was old. She had long before lost her husband. When Sri Ramakrishna was just a boy, she had lost her husband. She had lost her other sons. She had had so much loss in life that Sri Ramakrishna was all that she had left. And so Sri Ramakrishna was insistent that his mother not be hurt. So he would wear the white cloth. But he was a sannyasi, and he had the spirit of a sannyasi all the rest of his life. And so he would go and just sit without saying anything. He didn't go and knock on the food and say, "Hey, do you have anything to eat? I'm hungry, give me something to eat." He didn't even go like a monk and say, "Narayana Hari," which is a sign that a monk has come and is asking for food, for bhiksha. He would just go and quietly sit with the idea that God will give me, and I will take that which God gives me. I'm not going to go and demand anything from anyone, not even in the traditional sense of going with a bag and saying Narayana Hari. So he would just go to the house, sit quietly, and then when someone would ask him what he wanted, and then he would say, "I'm hungry." And so then the householder would typically give him something to eat. So all of these things are signs of what state Sri Ramakrishna lived in. He continues, "One day I begged Mathur to take me to Devendra Tagore's house. I said, 'Devendra chants the name of God. I want to see him. Will you take me there?' Mathurbabu was a very proud man. How could one expect him to go to another man's house uninvited? At first he hesitated, but then he said, 'All right, Devendra and I were fellow students. I will take you to him.'" So again, I said just a bit ago that in India that sense of privacy is not there, that things are much more open, but there is a sense of protocol, and especially for a person that has some position of dignity in society, there are certain things that you don't do because of your dignity, because it will you'll look like a common person if you do such and such an act. So Mathurbabu, being a very wealthy man and the proprietor of the Rani's estate and so forth, he wasn't going to go to someone's house uninvited. But Sri Ramakrishna, he had such devotion to Sri Ramakrishna that when Sri Ramakrishna pressed him, he said, "Okay." And then he rationalized it because he'd gone to school with Devendranath. So Devendranath Tagore was, I believe, the grandfather of Rabindranath Tagore, and he was one of the important founders of the Brahmo Samaj, and a very, very well-known person in Bengal of that day, and known in other countries as well. As Keshav Sen later was also. And both of them are alive at the same time, but Devendra was a very old man when Keshav Sen had not yet become so old. So he continues, "Another day I learnt of a good man named Dinamukherjee living at Bagh Bazaar near a bridge. He was a devotee. I asked Mathur to take me there. Finding me insistent, he took me to Dina's house in a carriage." Again, he didn't want to go, but he agreed because of Sri Ramakrishna's insistence. "It was a small place. The arrival of a rich man in a big carriage embarrassed the inmates. We too were embarrassed. That day, Dina's son was being invested with the sacred thread. The house was crowded, and there was hardly any place for Dina to receive us. We were about to enter a side room when someone cried out, 'Please, don't go into that room. There are ladies there.' It was really a distressing situation. Returning, Mathurbabu said, 'Father, I shall never listen to you again.' I laughed." So a couple of things, minor things. These are not important things for understanding what's going on here, but just minor things that I thought of while reading this. One is that, where was it? That it says, "The arrival of a rich man in a big carriage embarrassed the inmates." So this is a very minor point for an editor. But of course, in the West, in America or England or South Africa or wherever, where English is the mother tongue, no one would say inmates, because inmates refers usually to prisoners. One would say the residents. So I don't know how this passed Swami Nikhilananda's editors, but somehow it did. So we too were embarrassed. That day, Dina's son was being invested with the sacred thread. That is, when a Brahmin, it used to be the higher three castes. Then long ago, it became restricted just to Brahmins. They got this the sacred thread that they would wear, a sign of their investiture with the sacred thread, which gave them the right to study the Vedas. And then the Dayananda Saraswati, the Dayananda who founded the Arya Samaj, he extended that right to all, even the Shudras and others. In fact, I used to see, and that was a very good thing that he did. I would see when I lived at Mayavati that even the Rams and others, the Dobis, the washermen and others, they would wear the sacred thread and keep the shika. That was a very good thing. That's the kind of thing that Swami Vivekananda wanted, that everybody be lifted up to the Brahmin. Not to pull the Brahmin down to make the Brahmin like everyone else, but pull everyone up. And that was the original idea in the Soviet Union with the communist revolution. It changed with time because of the weakness of human beings. But the original idea in Russia was that everyone would be lifted up to the level of the nobility. In fact, the Moscow subway, which is so extraordinarily beautifully done, I don't know what condition it's in nowadays, but I went in 1960, that was the spring of 68, and when it was still the Soviet Union, and the Moscow subway was phenomenally beautiful with chandeliers and beautiful artwork on the walls and things, not the later Soviet style worker art, but real beautiful artwork. The idea was that they were going to build a society where everyone could enjoy that which the nobility had had before. So that was Dayananda's practice. So anyway, the investiture with the sacred thread means that going through the ceremony as a boy, and getting the right to study the Vedas, and getting one's initial meditation instructions where you learn the Gayatri mantra, and from that point on, you're supposed to recite the Gayatri in the morning and in the evening, at sunrise and sunset, as well as other ceremonies. And then they started to go into a side room, and someone shouts, there were ladies in there. This was in the period, it doesn't mean that they were going by mistake into a restroom or something like that. No, this was the era of parda, which had come into Indian society largely through the Muslim influence. And so the habit came of protecting the women, keeping the women hidden from the rest of society. So that when you read Ramakrishna's life, you read about I think it was the Lahas in Kamarpukur, Dharmadas Laha, who was very proud of the fact that no one had ever seen the women of his house. So that was why the upset, and why it was such a distressing situation. And so Mathurbabu reacted, "I will never listen to you again, Baba." And Sri Ramakrishna just laughed. "Oh, what a state I passed through. Once Kumar Singh gave a feast to the sadhus and invited me too. I found a great many holy men assembled there. When I sat down for the meal, several sadhus asked me about myself. At once I felt like leaving them and sitting alone. I wondered why they should bother about all that. The sadhus took their seats. I began to eat before they had started. I heard several of them remark, 'Oh, what sort of man is this?' And so again, this is not important for the spiritual teaching, but just for those who are not familiar with the culture and everything. It's as common as a meritorious act to feed sadhus. And so sometimes you invite sadhus to come, householders or institutions will invite sadhus to come for a feast. And for this one, Sri Ramakrishna was invited also. But Sri Ramakrishna would not have been recognized as a sadhu because he wore a white cloth and he had his hair and beard. The traditional practice for sadhus in India is You either keep your head and face shaven, and you can go for a month without shaving, but then you shave it, so it gets a little bit like this, and then you shave again, or you let your hair and beard grow without tending to them. One or the other. Either you shave everything, or you let everything grow and don't bother with it. And so Sri Ramakrishna was neither, and so he wouldn't have been recognized as a sadhu. And so then the sadhus begin to question him about himself. Why was he upset at that? For two reasons. One is that one should not ask a sadhu about their past and about their worldly associations and so forth. Even in our order, that's considered bad form to ask a sadhu, well, where do you come from, and so forth. And so Sri Ramakrishna was displeased by the fact that they were asking him questions about himself. But more importantly, he was upset that these are sadhus. Their mind is supposed to be absorbed in God, and yet they're making a little chit-chat like that. So, of course, Sri Ramakrishna, whose mind always went towards God, he was he noticed things like that. And then the sadhus, why did they react when Sri Ramakrishna started eating before they did? Because they were sadhus. So it was a sadhu bhandara. So why should this man in regular householder's clothes start eating when the sadhus have not yet started eating? So all of that is woven into the meaning of this paragraph. Let's see. Oh, this is a good place to stop. So why don't I stop here? Because now M breaks the narration and says now it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So we'll stop here and continue next week at this point. So let me give announcements, and if by the end of the announcements there are any questions, I will take those. Otherwise, we will close. For announcements, the big announcement, of course, is this Saturday, day after tomorrow, we have our Durga Puja, our annual celebration of the worship of the Divine Mother in the form of Durga. It's earlier than the actual Durga Puja because when this center was founded, there was already Durga Bari, a Durga temple near us. And so we assured them that we would not compete for attendance with them, but we would have ours on the Saturday before their main worship. And so that we have continued to follow. So our worship is this Saturday, the 17th, which is actually the beginning of Navaratri, the 9 days of celebration. And it will begin at 10 o'clock in the morning. And the main worship will go from 10 until 12. So it'll be a shortened worship, a 2-hour worship. At 12 o'clock, there'll be the arati, or the bhog, the food offering, the hot food offering, and the arati. And by 12:30, the worship should be over. And so by 12:30 until 2:30, for those 2 hours, 12:30 to 2:30, people can come. During the worship, no one will be allowed inside except for those who are volunteers, prearranged volunteers who are doing service, helping with the worship. Others will not be allowed inside. But at 12:30, people will be allowed in, one family unit or an individual at a time, to come in, to see the image, to offer a flower, and then to exit by a different direction and to receive fruit and sweet prasad. This year we won't be serving everyone a full meal. Again, all of this because of the pandemic. So those who would like to come and offer a flower and to bow down to the mother will be welcomed to come between 12:30 and 2:30. So we have to have a cutoff time. So 2:30 is the time when we will close. So please feel free to come, but you must wear a mask. And again, we will socially distance, and you'll be allowed to come in briefly and then to continue out. So that's the main announcement. On Sunday, there will be a lecture. I will speak on the Chandi, or the Devi Mahatmyam, the great text which relates the story of Mother Durga. And then next week, on Tuesday and Thursday, we'll continue our classes as usual. Tuesday, 7:30 in the evening, live streamed Bhagavad Gita class. And next Thursday at 11 o'clock, this class again on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So those are the announcements for now. Are there any questions? No questions. So I'll give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirsa Namamaha.